What is up, Who Dat Nation? Back with another pregame show from Boo Crew Media. Chris Rosvoglou here with John Hendrix. Saints, Bengals, going to be a lot of homecoming storylines, revenge game storylines. Former Saints versus former Saints on the Bengals, former Bengals on the Saints, switching sides here. It should be a fun one. And as always, this pregame show is presented by DraftKings Sportsbook. And right now, NFL fans can get in on the action by making any $5 bet and get $200 in free bets if your pick wins. All you have to do is download the DraftKings Sportsbook app today and use the promo code BOOT, all capital letters, and you get that value. So let's get into it, John. Saints, Bengals, the main storyline here has really been kind of the injuries for the Saints. Michael Thomas out, Marshawn Lattimore now out, Jarvis Landry out. So, I mean, you hear all those names. Obviously, there's still a path to victory, but it does make it a bit more challenging. How do you think that kind of affects everything for the Saints?
Well, I mean, it affects it greatly because you have a short week coming up. So you have the Cardinals right behind you, right? And so, not having Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry, they had found a way last week, just being behind that offensive line, running the football with Taysom Hill and Alvin Kamara. I think that's a big part of what you'll see against the Bengals tomorrow. And look, they're going to have to find a way with the receivers they got. And we know Chris Olave is a real game changer there. And I think he's kind of asserted himself as wide receiver one so far. And so, look, I think for him, it just depends on where he's at in the concussion protocol. I think it's optimistic on his outlook to play. He was a full participant of practice on Friday, so that's a good, encouraging step. But it's one of those things where we really won't know until 90 minutes to kick off with the inactives hit. Hopefully he's out there, because if not, you're going to be looking at Marquez Callaway, Traquan Smith. Then they're going to call up Rashid Shaheed from the practice squad, most likely, if they don't make moves to put him on the active roster. That could be Kevin White on there, Kirk Merritt. I don't know. It just depends. So throwing the football might be a little bit of a challenge, but Andy Dalton didn't have to do a ton of that last week. And so that's one thing, what I can tell you about Jarvis Landry is that his left ankle still looks pretty heavily wrapped. Doesn't seem like he looks right now. And Dennis Allen had told us this week that, it's pretty much a setback, something that, he heard against the Panthers, tried to come back out there, toughed it out against the Vikings, just hasn't been able to get on the field. So that's a bit of concern. From what I've heard, Marshawn Lattimore, it looks like it's a kidney injury. He's pretty taped around his midsection, if you will. And so, it's one of those situations where I think they're being a little bit more cautious. Marshawn probably felt like he could play in this game, and so he wants to be out there for his team. And then Michael Thomas is a mystery. Update from DA is that, he's in the rehab progress and he's there. It's just kind of seems the same answer we kind of keep getting, but, it becomes a question: if he misses 4 games, why didn't you just put him on IR? You know what I mean? But at any rate, that's different stories, but they're going to have their hands full tomorrow, and it figures to be the defensive battle versus Joe Burrow in the offense, because I think they can move the football in this Bengals defense. It's just how can they limit Joe Burrow tomorrow in the possessions and Jamar Chase and those talented guys that they have.
Yeah, and you mentioned moving the ball on the Bengals defense. We saw last weekend, and we kind of knew because of the matchup, Seattle at the time was the 29th run defense, that New Orleans was really going to pound the rock and just prioritize running the football. Do you think that's kind of what we should expect to see? I know last week the Bengals gave up 155 yards on the ground to the Ravens, so should we expect more Kamara, more Taysom Hill? Obviously, Taysom's health progress was going up. Kamara, you didn't even see on the injury report, which, kind of gets lost in the shuffle with all the bad news, but that seems to be good that the rib isn't bothering him much at this point. So do you expect kind of another heavy ground attack against this Bengals team?
Yeah, I do. And I think the thing that you look at the Ravens game is they mixed it up. They had a lot of guys running the football. It wasn't just Lamar Jackson, wasn't just one of their running backs. They had mixed it around and moved it around a good bit. And I think that they get Mark Ingram involved a good bit here. Again, just anybody that can help lean on that offensive line, which again, knock on wood, is pretty healthy at the moment. So I think that's where you lean on this game. And what I like about the ground game is just the fact that you can control the clock and dominate the time of possession as many times as you can limit what Joe Burrow has on his hands. I think that's the best thing. And look, I'll tell you, we talked to Chris Richard earlier today, and one of the things that we might see in this game is that if Joe doesn't see stuff, develop downfield, there's going to be a lot of check downs. There's going to be a lot of short and intermediate stuff, and the Saints are going to take that all day, but really bend, don't break when it comes down to red zone and all those types of opportunities. So look, you obviously don't want to see the deep play happen against this team. But as far as them and their best friend, I think is running the football. They don't need a ton out of their wide receivers. Just convert some key third downs. We saw Traquan Smith drop a couple last week, or he should have had 2 of those catches. made a big one when it counted most. Look, this is an area where it's shades last year where you're at in your wide receiver room, and so it's tough to see, but this is kind of where they are, and maybe you can lean on the tight end game a little bit more. Maybe you throw out Jawan Johnson on the outside a little bit too. That's an area where they could use him. So there's some ways that you can move the football, but I think the ground game is going to be their number one friend on Sunday.
Yeah, and speaking of moving the football through the air, right? If Chris Olave plays, that'd be a huge boost for this team. But even regardless, with the Andy Dalton situation, Jameis Winston obviously practicing this week. What have you guys heard on that development? Because for the Saints, it's a little different. You have that quick turnaround. You have the Thursday night game against the Cardinals right after. So could this be a situation where Andy Dalton starts tomorrow and then all of a sudden it's back to Jameis Winston Thursday? Is it too early for the Saints to kind of determine what's going on in the quarterback situation? What's kind of been the early feel throughout either watching Jameis at practice or what DA has been saying this week?
Yeah, look, Jameis has looked pretty decent this week, and I think that's encouraging. But, look, his ankle's still pretty taped up, and I think this is one of those situations where let's roll with Andy. A short week again, unless you get guys like Mike and Jarvis back in the lineup, which I don't know if I'll see it from Jarvis. Thomas is another equal. So I think they might be playing 2 of these games without both of those guys, but we'll see how it shapes out. I don't think there's any hurry to put Winston out there, especially when you could go the short week with Andy, have that preparation already ready to go. Then you have a mini bye, if you will, almost 10 days away from your next game against the Raiders at home. So look, I don't think you're going to say there's a controversy at quarterback or anything like that, even if Andy plays lights out, because I still feel like this is Jameis's team. But it is interesting that he's questionable entering this game as opposed to being doubtful kind of or ruled out the past couple of weeks. And so look, that back ankle, it's only supposed to get better with time, but I just don't think this is a situation where if you do play him or if he is active tomorrow, it's more of a backup type role. This is definitely Andy as the starter tomorrow, and I would think that he would get the nod on Thursday, assuming nothing crazy happens.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. And obviously, Andy Dalton going up against his former team. He's actually 2-0 against the Bengals. That's something Saints fans will throw out there. And how much it weighs on tomorrow's game, obviously, that's not really a big impact. But flipping it over to the other quarterback spot with Joe Burrow, we talked about it before. They're going to want to move the ball through the air, obviously, with Jamar Chase. And we'll see what happens with T. Higgins. Didn't practice Wednesday and Thursday, limited on Friday. But we've seen this Bengals offense at times this year relative to last year kind of stall out. And it's part of what you mentioned, right? Not giving up those big plays. For the Saints, when you look in the trenches, I know people have complained about maybe the D-line not producing a high level of sacks, but I see Cam Jordan over the last 3 games kind of increasing his play. I'd go back to the Vikings game and say Davenport looks sharp there. What's your confidence level in the trenches in terms of the Saints getting pressure on Joe Burrow at a consistent rate?
Yeah, look, I think the defensive line has only improved over the past several games. Again, it was one of those things when, Cam Jordan's going to try to make it work. And Marcus Davenport, obviously Peyton Turner not playing in this game with a chest injury, but, getting interior push is obviously big. Guys like David Onyemata and Malcolm Roach are going to be huge for this particular game. And look, they're going to have to find a way. I feel like they can at least affect his timing. It's one of those things where, you probably want to think, we'll just be aggressive and blitz. And that's not always the smartest thing because Joe's pretty good against the blitz, obviously. And so, look, I think that the front 4 can get some pressure. I think when you look at the Bengals offensive line, still a lot of opportunities there. I think they can get home on them for sure. And I think that's going to be a huge thing because a lot of times you talk about the secondary, the pass rush can be their best friend to disrupt the timing. If they can just get there a half second different or force a throw just a half second earlier, then it makes a big difference in the world. And look, I think Cam Jordan's playing some of his best football right now. I think Marcus Davenport is a guy that, even though you're not saying, oh, man, this guy's lighting up the sack sheet, he's got some rushes on him that he's just absolutely dominating people. And, for everybody that talked about how he was always hurt and not playing and all this other stuff, he's really come on a good bit this season. And so I feel good about their rotation and how they can get after the quarterback. But of course, we'll always see how the things unfold because the Bengals are going to know that. And if you play the Saints, you like to get that ball out quick because if you hold on to it too much, I mean, look at what happened with Geno Smith some last week. They're going to try to affect that as well as much as they can. And it starts with that pass rush. And they know that they have got to get after him on Sunday.
Yeah, and, you mentioned before with Lattimore, him being out, puts a lot of pressure on Paulson Debo if a Debo plays. Obviously that's still a questionable situation. I know that, throughout training camp, throughout the preseason, so much talk about Adebo and how good he's been. What have you seen, John, at least through the first couple of games that he's been on the field, that he hasn't performed at that level? Do you think it's knocking off rust? Do you think it's the injury aspect of things? What has it kind of been for you?
Yeah, I don't think it's just it's a matter of rust, and I don't think he's 100% yet. And again, I think his ankle's still taped up. Not to think, but I've seen his ankle still taped up a little bit. So that's not a big deal. I think we've talked about it before. Even if he's like 85, 90%, he's still going to play. But look, I think he's only going to get better with each week that progresses. Played limited snaps, really third down presence against the Panthers. Vikings had some struggles, some moments, and then obviously against the Seahawks. And I think some of this has to do with the back end too, the safety help. And this is why it's important to get somebody like Marcus May back in the lineup. Nothing against Justin Evans or not having a PJ Williams back there. But look, that communication has got to be spot on. And with Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu, that's something the communication has been worked on all training camp and such. And it's time where they need those guys to really step up to the plate, because Adebo, I don't know, we'll have to see tomorrow. I don't think they're going to shadow him against Jamar Chase. They may play rotational sides. We saw Bradley Roby. They lucked out kind of last week where, Geno Smith had DK Metcalf in the end zone. If he catches that for a touchdown, it's a different story, right? And so, those are the types of things. I think Bradley Roby and Adebo can play fine, and they don't have to play perfect. Just play well enough to limit some of those big plays, because, Jamar Chase, just like, Justin Jefferson, he's going to eat. He's going to get some success on there. But as far as the big plays, that's where you can't afford to have that happen. And really, the other thing for me is the tackling. Some of the tackling has been pretty bad over the past couple of weeks. And so just some opportunistic opportunities. And there's a lot of guilty hands in that, right? But, those are areas where they just have to bring it tomorrow and be able to respond accordingly against the Bengals. And I think if they can do that, if they can just be pretty good on defense and then get what they need out of the offense from the ground game, I think they can win this game.
Yeah, it's definitely out there. And I think for the Saints, and it's something that I've kind of talked about earlier this week, and I'm not saying this is going to dictate the entire game, but when you're down players, it's something that matters. We've mentioned, Rashid Shaheed and him possibly making his debut. Saints haven't really exactly flipped the field on the return game this season. I know Callaway had a nice return last week, but outside of that, it's been more bad than it's been good. Is there another X factor in addition to something like that where, like, let's say Rashid Shaheed has a big return and that gives them a spark, that you're looking at this game and you're saying maybe there's a certain player that people aren't talking about that much, but man, they can have a really big impact on this game. And not saying necessarily a sleeper, but it's not the Alvin Kamara, the Taysom Hill, the people that are getting all that recognition. Who's someone for this particular matchup, John, that you think could be an X factor?
Yeah, look, I think I look at the tight end department. I think Adam Troutman could be a little bit more of a factor here. And again, it just depends on how the game unfolds. But look, he's been a favored target of Andy Dalton. Juwan Johnson has kind of drifted back in the shadows, if you will, not for anything that he's done, just that Jameis was real comfortable with him. And it looks like Andy's comfortable with Adam a little bit. And so I think that he can find some success. I mean, you see the games that like Mark Andrews has, or just some of those types of matchups and success. I think that's a way to kind of maybe look at it and say, obviously, you think Olave would come in here and do well. And I think Callaway can do fine. I think Traquan Smith can do fine. But let's just be real. I don't think they're going to go off and do like 150 yards and a touchdown or anything like that. But I think Troutman's a guy that when you look at it, when you need a conversion on third down, you trust him to get things done. I think he can be a lot more involved in this passing game. They need to go to him a little bit more often, just to, as a, I don't say security blanket, but I think he'd be Dalton's best friend tomorrow. So that's my guy, I would say, on offense that would definitely be able to help move the chains a good bit and probably have a little bit better game than some people have thought about.
Yeah, certainly. That's a pretty good pick. I mean, had it not been for a skeptical pass or drop, whatever people want to call it, he would have had 2 touchdowns last week. So that's actually, a savvy pick there. Last question before we wrap it up, John, and this is more so a fan-related thing, not the matchup itself. Over under 25% of the fans in the building wearing something Joe Burrow related.
I think it's 25% or more, and it's tough because I think some of the this is one of those things where it's like, I don't know why this game wasn't a prime time when you first started it in this year, but I think there's going to be a good bit. And it's obviously one of those focal points where we've seen, crowds take over the dome. I think Buffalo is one of them that we saw last year. And, before that travel well. So I think Chicago fans or Pittsburgh fans travel well. Dallas does too. I don't know how that's going to play out because some people have talked about, well, you're not really a fan if you're trying to, because everybody's got to remember they got LSU on the Saints too. I mean, it's really going to be just Tyrann Mathieu, but I think that's obviously from people that have followed OG LSU for a while. Everybody knows about the Honey Badger, and so again, Joe Burrow there. I think you'll see a good bit of LSU purple and gold out there, and look, hopefully they're on the side of the Saints and try to at least affect a little bit on Joe, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a good homecoming for him just because of what he did and recency bias, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about taking over the Dome, that can't happen if the Saints keep it a close game. The Bills one wasn't. That's kind of what led to it. We'll see what happens. Saints Bengals this Sunday afternoon. Joe Burrow homecoming, arguably Andy Dalton revenge game, if people want to call it that such. A lot of storylines. We'll see what happens. But that's going to do it for this pregame edition of Boo Crew Media. Chris Rosvoglou here with John Hendrix. As always, guys, thank you for tuning in. And we'll be back for probably a short week. Cardinals Saints coming up Thursday. But for now, they have to take care of business against the Bengals.